So Simple tutorial. Good morning students. Welcome to SST So Simple tutorial. In the previous class we had discussed briefly on the Second World War, the beginning of Cold War, concept of Cold War and the logic of deterrence. Dear students, your lesson 1 actually begins with the Cuban Missile Crisis and then it discusses the Cold War. But I chose to discuss the concepts of Cold War first before discussing the Cuban Missile Crisis. So today's topic will be the Cuban Missile Crisis. My dear students, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and this was the moment when both these superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict. So what happened in Cuba? What led to this crisis? To understand this, let us first see the location of Cuba in the world map. Cuba is an island between the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. It lies to the north of Jamaica and to the south of Florida and Bahamas. Its neighboring countries are the Bahamas, Haiti, the USA and Jamaica. Now let us see the main players of the Cuban crisis. This is John F. Kennedy. He was the US President who served from 1961 till 1963. This gentleman is Fidel Castro. He was the leader of Cuba who served as the Prime Minister of Cuba from 1959 to 1976 and President from 1976 to 2008. And this is Nikita Khrushchev, the President of USSR from 1958 to 1964. He had succeeded Stalin, who had died in 1953. On 1st of January 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the government of Batista and took over the control of Cuba. Batista was the military dictator of Cuba. Thereafter, Castro ruled Cuba from 1959 to 2008. When Castro took over Cuba, he ordered that American-owned businesses would be taken over. That means they would be nationalized. America was not happy with this decision. Thereafter, in 1960, Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union in a trade deal. This further angered the US. The US officially cut all diplomatic ties with Cuba in January 1961. Thereafter, the US government trained some 1500 Cuban exiles and tried to overthrow the communist regime of Castro through them. Exile means those people who were expelled or forced out of their native country for some political reasons. So US used these exiles against the Castro government. But Castro troops defeated the Cuban exile army. This incident is called Bay of Pigs invasion. So this operation, backed by the US, failed. But Castro feared a new attack from the USA. By now, Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union and received both diplomatic and financial aid from it. So he looked toward the USSR, who were willing to provide assistance. This is a small background before we go into the book. In April 1961, the leaders of the USSR were worried that the USA would invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. So Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of Soviet Union, decided to convert Cuba into a Russian base to deter any further attempt of invasion. In 1962, the Soviet Union began secretly placing ballistic missiles in Cuba that were capable of firing nuclear weapons into American cities. Dear students, so far America had enjoyed geographical isolation and was never severely attacked other than the attack on the Pearl Harbor. America has always been in an advantageous position because of its geography. The two oceans on two sides, plus Mexico and Canada as the two good neighbors. This has always provided US a high degree of security. Now see, how far is the US from Cuba? And how far is the US from the USSR? USSR is very far and so there is no threat from that side. But Cuba is quite close to the US territory barely 90 kilometers from US shores. So it was a direct security threat to the US. The installation of these weapons in Cuba had put USA for the first time in a danger zone. The US was now under a close range of fire by the USSR weapons. You can see this on the map. This had put millions of Americans, besides a number of defense bases and cities, in the range of weapons that could hit them within a few minutes if launched from Cuba. You can see Los Angeles, Seattle, Chicago, Washington, New York, Atlanta, Havana, Miami, all cities within the range of the missiles. Americans were not aware of these developments until a spy plane of the US discovered this on the 14th of October 1962. Kennedy discussed with his advisors about the options they had and what could be done. They could invade Cuba, or they could go for airstrikes against the missile bases, or they could blockade Cuba to stop more deliveries from the USSR. But in any case, two things were clear. One, they were reluctant to do anything that might lead to full-scale nuclear war between the two countries. And two, they were determined to get Soviet Union to remove the missiles and nuclear weapons from Cuba. Finally, the US decided to blockade Cuba. Blockade means to surround a place or a country by soldiers or ships to stop people or goods from going in or out. This is what you can see on the screen. Kennedy ordered American warships to intercept any Soviet ships heading to Cuba as a way of warning the USSR of its seriousness. Students, this was a point that was the peak of tension. American and Soviet naval vessels came into close proximity. A nuclear war seemed imminent. This is what made the whole world nervous. The world held its breath for nearly 2 weeks in October 1962. But to the world's great relief, both sides acted sensibly and decided to avoid war. Soviet ships turned around before reaching the blockade. Dear students, in the entire episode, Yu Thon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, contributed greatly to defuse the crisis. He had made appeals to both the US and Soviet leadership. After accepting his appeals, both the leaders acted sensibly. They had their own exchanges through letters and messengers, and thus they managed to reach an agreement on the formula that eventually ended the missile crisis. Thanks to the timely and positive negotiation between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The US promised not to invade Cuba and Khrushchev promised to withdraw the missiles. So students, you will agree that the Cuban Missile Crisis was rightly a high time of the Cold War. There was an atmosphere of tension. There was a clear confrontation between the US and the USSR. A nuclear conflict seemed imminent. But what was the end result? Both the leaders acted responsibly and decided to avoid another war. So all is well that ends well, isn't it? Let me stop here, students. Now you go through your textbook properly to have a better understanding of the topic. In the next class, we will discuss the emergence of the two power blocks. Till then, have a nice time. Thank you.